The rain fell in sheets against the windows of Thornfield Manor, each drop a hammer blow against Lady Catherine Ashworth's composure. She stood in her father's study, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles had gone white beneath her silk gloves. The Earl of Thornfield sat behind his mahogany desk, his weathered face grave, his eyes unable to meet those of his only daughter. "Father, you cannot be serious," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "General Blackwood? The butcher of Crimea." The Earl flinched at the moniker, but his resolve did not waver. "The debts are substantial, Catherine. The estate is mortgaged beyond redemption. If we do not accept the General's offer, we shall lose everything. The manor, the lands, your mother's memory preserved in these walls." "But he is a monster," Catherine protested, her composure beginning to crack. "The newspapers call him cruel, merciless. They say he ordered the execution of prisoners, that he burned villages, that he shows no mercy to anyone, soldier or civilian alike." "The newspapers print what sells copies," her father replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "General Blackwood has offered to settle our debts entirely in exchange for your hand in marriage. He asks nothing else, no dowry, no conditions. He has seen your portrait and expressed interest." Catherine turned away, pressing her hand to her mouth. At 23, she had already refused half a dozen suitors, waiting for something her heart whispered might exist, a connection, an understanding, perhaps even love. Now she was to be sold like a mare at auction to a man whose very name inspired fear across the empire. "When?" she asked finally, her voice hollow. "The ceremony is arranged for a fortnight hence. He arrives tomorrow to make your acquaintance." General Marcus Blackwood dismounted from his black stallion in the courtyard of Thornfield Manor with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than in drawing-rooms. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained against his military coat. His face was harsh, all sharp angles and stern lines, with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from Sebastopol. His eyes, however, were what drew attention, a pale gray that seemed to see through pretense and into the soul itself. He had not wanted to come. Marriage had never been part of his plans, but at 40 years of age he found himself subject to pressures he could not combat with cavalry charges or strategic brilliance. His family name required an heir. His sister had written him no fewer than 30 letters on the subject. And when he had seen the portrait of Lady Catherine Ashworth, those intelligent eyes, that proud bearing, something in his war-weary heart had stirred. The Earl greeted him with barely concealed nervousness, his handshake damp with perspiration. They exchanged pleasantries in the entrance hall, surrounded by portraits of Ashworth ancestors who seemed to glare down at the general with aristocratic disapproval. "My daughter will join us presently," the Earl said, gesturing toward the drawing-room. "She is adjusting to the situation." "I imagine she is terrified," Marcus said bluntly, "given what the scandal sheets print about me." The Earl had the grace to look uncomfortable. "General, I assure you, do not insult my intelligence, my lord. I know what they call me. The butcher of Crimea, the cruel general, the man without mercy." Marcus's voice was cold, factual. "I am here because you need my money and I require a wife. Let us not pretend this is a love match." Before the Earl could respond, the door opened and Catherine entered. Marcus had thought the portrait flattering but inaccurate, as such things often were. He was wrong. Lady Catherine Ashworth was more striking in person, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but arresting. She had dark auburn hair pinned in an elegant chignon, revealing a long, graceful neck. Her eyes were the color of amber, sharp with intelligence and, at present, barely suppressed fear. She wore a day dress of deep blue that complemented her coloring, and she held herself with a dignity that spoke of breeding and courage. She curtsied, the gesture perfect but perfunctory. "General Blackwood." He bowed. "Lady Catherine." Their eyes met, and Marcus saw it clearly. The fear, yes, but also defiance. This woman would not be easily broken. Good. He had no use for timid creatures. "Shall we walk in the garden?" he suggested. "The rain has stopped." Catherine glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly, and she accepted Marcus's offered arm with the enthusiasm of a prisoner mounting the scaffold. They walked in silence for several minutes along the gravel paths between the rose beds. Catherine kept her eyes fixed ahead, her spine rigid. Marcus, accustomed to the silences of military camps and battlefields, felt no need to fill the void with meaningless chatter. Finally, Catherine spoke. "I suppose you expect me to play the grateful bride, General. To simper and pretend that I am pleased with this arrangement." "I expect nothing of the sort," Marcus replied evenly. "I am not a fool, Lady Catherine. This marriage is a transaction. Your father receives financial salvation. I receive a wife of suitable breeding. There is no need for pretense between us." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her amber eyes blazing. "Tell me, is it true what they say? Did you order the execution of prisoners at Crimea? Did you burn villages?" Marcus had expected the questions, but hearing them spoken aloud by this woman, whose opinion mattered in a way he could not quite explain, struck deeper than anticipated. "Yes," he said simply. Catherine paled but held her ground. "And you feel no remorse?" "I did not say that." Marcus's jaw tightened. "War is not a ballroom, Lady Catherine. It is not governed by the rules of polite society. I made decisions that saved British lives. I made decisions that ensured victory. Whether those decisions were merciful is not for me to judge. But the newspapers say." The newspapers are written by men who have never held a dying soldier in their arms, who have never had to choose between the lives of their men and the rules of engagement that exist only on paper. His voice remained level, but Catherine could hear the steel beneath it. "They print what creates outrage, what sells copies. The truth is more complicated and far less entertaining." "Then tell me the truth," Catherine demanded. "If we are to be married, if I am to bear your name, I deserve to know what manner of man you are." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Most women of his acquaintance would have fainted by now or dissolved into tears. This one stood before him, demanding answers, her fear transmuted into courage. "Very well," he said, "but not here. If you truly wish to understand, you must be willing to listen to things that will disturb you." They returned to the manor and closeted themselves in the library, much to the Earl's visible anxiety. Marcus dismissed the servants and poured himself a brandy before settling into a leather chair. Catherine sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression expectant. "The incident at Crimea that earned me the sobriquet Butcher involved the execution of 37 prisoners," Marcus began without preamble. "They were Russian soldiers who had been captured after a particularly brutal engagement. Standard protocol dictated they be held and eventually exchanged. However, we had intelligence, reliable intelligence, that a larger Russian force was moving to our position. We were outnumbered, low on supplies, and could not guard prisoners while fighting off an attack." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "So you executed them?" "I gave the order, yes. But that is not the complete story." Marcus took a sip of brandy. "What the newspapers failed to report was that I offered every prisoner the opportunity to give their parole, their word of honor not to take up arms against us again. If they had agreed, I would have released them. Every single man refused." "Perhaps they did not trust your word," Catherine suggested. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they were more afraid of being branded traitors by their own command than they were of death." Marcus set down his glass. "I gave them a choice, Lady Catherine. More than that, I made it swift and as painless as circumstances allowed. The alternative would have been to tie up soldiers as guards, weaken our defensive position, and likely lose British lives when the attack came. I chose to protect my men. And the villages? Catherine pressed. They say you burned entire villages to the ground. 3 villages, Marcus corrected, all of which were being used to supply and hide enemy forces. I evacuated the civilians first. Every man, woman, and child was removed and provided with compensation. Then I burned the buildings to deny the enemy resources. The newspapers reported the burning but neglected to mention the evacuation. It made for a more sensational story that way. Catherine absorbed this in silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the book-lined walls. "Why do you not defend yourself?" she asked finally. "Why do you allow them to print such lies?" "They are not lies," Marcus said quietly. "I did execute prisoners. I did burn villages. The context may be different from what is reported, but the actions themselves are accurate. And I have found, Lady Catherine, that men who have not been to war have little interest in the moral complexities of command. They prefer their heroes pure and their villains absolute. I fit neither category, so they have made their choice. You let them think the worst of you. I stopped caring what they think." He met her gaze directly. "But I find, oddly enough, that I care what you think. I will not lie to you, Lady Catherine. I have done terrible things in service to my country. I have made decisions that haunt me still. But I am not the monster they paint me to be." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens now bathed in late afternoon sunlight. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She had come to this interview expecting to confirm her worst fears, to steel herself for a life married to a cruel man. Instead, she found something more troubling: complexity, nuance, perhaps even integrity. "You could have lied to me," she said softly. "You could have denied everything, painted yourself as a victim of slander." "I could have," Marcus agreed. "But we will be married, and you would eventually learn the truth. I prefer to begin as we mean to continue, with honesty between us." Catherine turned back to face him. "And how do you mean for us to continue, General? What sort of marriage do you envision?" Marcus rose and crossed to her, stopping at a respectful distance. "I will not pretend affection I do not feel, nor do I expect it from you. But I believe we might achieve something more valuable: mutual respect. I will honor our marriage vows. I will provide for you, protect you, and treat you with the consideration you deserve. In return, I ask only that you manage my household and perform the social duties expected of a general's wife. Beyond that, you may live as you please." "A business arrangement," Catherine said. "An honest one." She studied his face, that harsh landscape of scars and stern lines, and found herself wondering what lay beneath. "Very well, General. I accept your terms." The wedding took place on a gray October morning with only immediate family in attendance. Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried white roses from the Thornfield Gardens. She moved through the ceremony as if in a dream, repeating her vows in a clear, steady voice while her hand trembled in Marcus's larger, calloused one. At the wedding breakfast, the few guests, mostly Marcus's military colleagues and Catherine's elderly aunts, maintained a polite but strained conversation. Catherine could feel their eyes upon her, filled with pity and curiosity in equal measure. The Earl drank too much champagne and gave a rambling toast about family and duty that satisfied no one. When the time came to depart for Marcus's London residence, Catherine embraced her father in the entrance hall. He whispered apologies into her hair, but she pulled away before he could finish. Forgiveness, if it came at all, would take time. The carriage journey to London took several hours. Catherine sat across from her new husband, watching the countryside roll past and wondering at the strangeness of her situation. This morning she had been Lady Catherine Ashworth, daughter of an earl. Now she was Mrs. Blackwood, wife to a man she barely knew, bound to him by law and contract. "Are you tired?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. "Somewhat. There will be a light supper waiting, but you may retire immediately if you prefer." He paused, then added, "I should tell you that I have given you the mistress's chambers. They adjoin mine, but have a separate entrance. You need not fear unwelcome intrusions." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. The wedding night, she had been dreading it since her father first broached the subject of marriage. "I thank you. I meant what I said about honesty, Catherine." He used her given name for the first time. "I will not come to your bed until you invite me. The marriage must be consummated eventually if we are to have children, but there is no urgency. We have time to become accustomed to one another." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You are kinder than I expected, General." "Marcus," he corrected. "We are married now. You should use my given name." "Marcus," she repeated, testing it on her tongue. "Very well. And you must call me Catherine." "Catherine." The way he said it, in that deep, gravelly voice, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Blackwood House stood in Belgrave Square, an imposing Georgian structure of white stone and severe classical lines that seemed to reflect its owner's character. The staff assembled in the entrance hall to greet their new mistress. The butler, the housekeeper, 2 footmen, a lady's maid, and various other servants whose names Catherine struggled to remember in her exhausted state. Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, was a woman of middle years with kind eyes and an efficient manner. She showed Catherine to her chambers, a spacious suite decorated in shades of cream and gold, with windows overlooking the square's private gardens. It was elegant without being ostentatious, comfortable without being stuffy. "The General had everything refurbished last month," Mrs. Henshaw explained as she showed Catherine the dressing-room and private sitting-room. "He wanted you to feel at home." Catherine ran her hand over the smooth mahogany of the writing-desk positioned by the window. On it lay fresh paper, pens, and a beautiful silver inkwell. "It is lovely." "He chose the desk himself," Mrs. Henshaw said with a smile. "Said he noticed you had a writing desk in your room at Thornfield and thought you'd want one here. If there is anything else you require, you have only to ask." After the housekeeper departed, Catherine sank into the chair by the fire and removed her shoes. Her new husband had refurbished these rooms for her, had noticed her writing desk and thought to provide one. These were not the actions of a cruel man, yet she could not quite reconcile the Marcus she was coming to know with the butcher of Crimea from the newspapers. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Marcus entered at her invitation, having changed from his formal wedding attire into a smoking jacket. He looked somehow less formidable in the casual dress, though no less imposing. "I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed," he said, remaining near the door. "It is perfect. Thank you for the desk." He seemed pleased. "I thought you might write letters. To your father, perhaps, or friends." "I have few friends," Catherine admitted. "Father kept me rather isolated after my mother died. He feared I would marry and leave him alone." "And now you have," Marcus observed. "How ironic." "Yes." She looked into the fire. "Though I suppose this is leaving of a different sort." Marcus crossed to the other chair and sat, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. "You may invite guests whenever you like. I am often at the War Office or attending meetings. The house is yours to manage as you see fit." "What about social obligations? Surely as a general's wife I must attend functions, host dinners." "Some, yes." "My sister, Margaret, will call upon you soon. She is well versed in society's expectations and can guide you. But I will not force you into situations that make you uncomfortable." He studied her thoughtfully. "I am not a particularly social creature, Catherine. The ton barely tolerates me as it is. I will not subject you to constant scrutiny if you prefer a quieter life. Because of your reputation? That, and because I have little patience for drawing-room politics and idle gossip. I spent 20 years in the army. I am accustomed to plain speaking and direct action. Society finds me abrasive. Catherine found herself smiling slightly. You are certainly direct. I consider it a virtue. As do I, she said, surprising herself. I have always detested the layers of pretense that govern polite conversation. One can speak for hours and say absolutely nothing of substance. Then we are in agreement. Marcus rose. I will leave you to rest. Breakfast is typically at 8, but Mrs. Henshaw will bring a tray to your room if you prefer. As he moved toward the connecting door to his own chambers, Catherine called out, "Marcus!" He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me time, for being understanding." His stern features softened almost imperceptibly. "We are bound together now, Catherine. I see no benefit in making you miserable. Good night." Good night. The first weeks of marriage established a pattern. Marcus rose early and departed for the War Office before Catherine woke. She spent her mornings managing the household, corresponding with her father, and exploring London's bookshops and museums with her new lady's maid, Ellen. Afternoons often included visits from Margaret, Marcus's sister, who proved to be warm, witty, and utterly devoted to her brother. "He has always been terribly misunderstood," Margaret confided over tea one afternoon. Even as a boy, Marcus was serious and direct. Father wanted him to be more charming, more politically minded, but it simply was not in his nature. The army suited him because it valued his strengths, his strategic mind, his leadership, his absolute integrity. "The newspapers paint quite a different picture," Catherine ventured. Margaret's expression hardened. "The newspapers are written by vipers and read by fools. They crucified Marcus because he was too successful, too effective. Jealous officers whispered lies, and reporters embellished them into sensational stories. My brother has more honor in his smallest finger than most men possess in their entire being." Catherine wanted to believe her, and with each passing day the evidence mounted in Marcus's favor. He was unfailingly courteous, respectful of her privacy, and generous with both money and consideration. The servants adored him, speaking of his fairness and rare but genuine kindness. She had watched him give coins to beggars on the street, had seen him carry a neighbor's package when he encountered the elderly gentleman struggling with it. These were not the actions of the monster from the newspapers. Evenings brought them together for dinner, which they took in the smaller dining room rather than the formal one. Marcus proved to be surprisingly good company once he relaxed. He spoke of his campaigns not with boastfulness but with the analytical mind of a chess player discussing strategy. He asked about her day with genuine interest and listened attentively to her observations about London society, the books she was reading, the art she had seen. One evening, nearly a month into their marriage, Catherine gathered her courage. "Marcus, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why did you truly offer for me? You could have had any number of women more socially connected, with larger dowries." Marcus set down his wine-glass and considered his answer carefully. "I saw your portrait. There was something in your expression, intelligence, spirit, perhaps a touch of sadness. You seemed real. Not the simpering society Mrs. I had been introduced to, who saw only my rank and fortune. You cannot have known that from a portrait." "No," he agreed. "But I trusted my instinct, and I have not been disappointed." Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest. "Nor have I," she said softly. "You are not at all what I expected, Marcus. Is that good or bad?" "Very good." She met his eyes across the table. "I was terrified of you, you know. I thought I was being sent to live with a monster. And now I think you are the most honorable man I have ever met, and I am ashamed that I believed the lies." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture so rare between them that Catherine's breath caught. His hand was warm, calloused, steady. "You believed what anyone would believe," he said. "I do not fault you for it. But I should have known better. I should have." "Catherine." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "We are discovering each other. That is all that matters." That night, lying in her bed, Catherine could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers. Something was shifting between them, something that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts turn in unexpected directions. The true test came 6 weeks into their marriage when Marcus invited Catherine to accompany him to a military ball at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. She had been dreading such events, knowing that the Tun's eyes would be upon her, judging the butcher's bride. "You need not go if you do not wish to," Marcus said when he extended the invitation. "But I confess I would prefer to have you beside me. These affairs are tedious enough without enduring them alone." "Will there be many people there who disapprove of you?" "Undoubtedly." His expression was wry. "But they cannot refuse to attend an event where I am guest of honor without making their disapproval too obvious for comfort. They will come, they will whisper, and they will maintain a veneer of civility. That hardly sounds pleasant for either of us." "No," Marcus agreed. "But it is part of our duty. And I have found that presenting a united front often silences the worst of the gossip." Catherine lifted her chin. "Then I shall go, and I shall be the most devoted wife they have ever seen." The night of the ball, Catherine dressed with particular care in a gown of deep burgundy silk that set off her coloring to perfection. Ellen had arranged her hair in an elegant upswept style with small pearls woven throughout. When she descended the stairs, Marcus was waiting in the entrance hall, magnificent in his dress uniform with its gold braid and rows of medals. He looked up as she descended, and something flickered in his gray eyes, admiration, perhaps even desire. "You are beautiful," he said simply. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look quite distinguished yourself." He offered his arm. "Shall we go face the lions?" The ballroom at Chelsea was magnificent, ablaze with candlelight and filled with London's elite. Catherine felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turned toward them as they were announced. The whispers began immediately, a susurrus of scandal and speculation that followed them like a wake. Marcus kept Catherine close, his hand firm at the small of her back. They made their way through the receiving line, greeting the host, an elderly colonel who had served with Marcus's father, and his wife. "Blackwood, good to see you, my boy," the colonel boomed. "And this must be your lovely bride." "Welcome, my dear, welcome." His wife, however, was less effusive. She smiled tightly at Catherine and murmured something about hoping she would be happy in her choice. As they moved into the ballroom proper, Catherine became aware of the careful choreography of social avoidance. Groups parted as they approached, creating clear spaces around them as if they carried contagion. Women whispered behind fans, their eyes sharp with judgment. Men nodded curtly but did not engage in conversation. Catherine felt Marcus tense beside her, though his expression remained impassive. "They are despicable," she whispered. "They are afraid," Marcus corrected. "I remind them of the cost of empire. It is easier to believe me a monster than to acknowledge that war requires monstrous choices." A woman's voice cut through the nearest group's whispers. "I simply cannot imagine what her father was thinking, giving her to that man. They say he is utterly brutal, you know. No feeling whatsoever." Catherine saw Marcus's jaw tighten, but before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Margaret, resplendent in emerald silk. "How fascinating," Margaret said loudly enough to carry. I have always found it curious how people who have never met someone feel qualified to judge their character. Tell me, Lady Pemberton, have you ever spoken with my brother beyond basic pleasantries? Lady Pemberton flushed. Well, that is to say. Because I have known him for 40 years, Margaret continued, her smile sharp as a blade. And I can assure you that his capacity for feeling is profound. Indeed, he feels things far more deeply than most men. He simply does not display his emotions for the entertainment of gossips. Really, Mrs. Halifax, there is no need to. Oh, but there is every need. Margaret looped her arm through Catherine's. My new sister has been subjected to quite enough whispers and sidelong glances for one evening. Come, Catherine, let us find more pleasant company. As Margaret led her away, Catherine glanced back at Marcus. He caught her eye and inclined his head slightly. Gratitude, perhaps, or respect. The evening improved somewhat after that. Margaret introduced Catherine to a small circle of military wives who proved surprisingly welcoming. They shared stories of campaigns and relocations, of the challenges of maintaining households while husbands were at war. Catherine found herself relaxing, even laughing at some of the more ridiculous anecdotes. When Marcus came to claim her for a waltz, the ballroom seemed to quiet slightly. All eyes turned to watch the butcher and his bride take the floor. "You are creating quite a stir," Marcus murmured as he led her into the first turn. "Your sister created the stir. I merely stood there." "You stood there with your head high and dignity intact. That is no small thing." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "You surprise me, Catherine. I thought this evening would be an ordeal for you." "It is an ordeal," she admitted. "But I will not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. And more importantly, I will not allow them to continue their persecution of you unchallenged." Marcus looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You defend me? You are my husband. Whatever the newspapers say, whatever society whispers, I know the truth of your character. And I will not stand by while they slander you." Something shifted in his eyes, surprise, warmth, perhaps even the beginning of something deeper. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." As the waltz ended and Marcus led her from the floor, Catherine realized with a jolt that she no longer felt like a prisoner in this marriage. Somewhere in the past weeks, without her quite noticing, her feelings had transformed. She no longer feared Marcus. She respected him, enjoyed his company, found herself thinking of him at odd moments throughout the day. She might even be falling in love with him. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, Catherine woke to find a note slipped under her door. Marcus's bold handwriting filled the page. "Catherine, thank you for last evening. Your support meant more than I can adequately express. I find myself constantly surprised by you, by your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. What began as a transaction has become something I treasure. I hope you do not think me too forward if I say that I consider myself fortunate to call you my wife. I am away to the War Office, but will return for dinner. Perhaps we might take a walk in the park afterward if the weather holds? Yours, Marcus." Catherine read the note 3 times, her heart racing. There was something in the phrasing, "something I treasure," that suggested his feelings had undergone a similar transformation to her own. That evening, they walked in Hyde Park as dusk fell. The late November air was crisp and cold, and Catherine was grateful for Marcus's arm to lean on as they navigated the paths. "I received an interesting letter today," Marcus said as they walked. "From Colonel Morrison. You met him last night. He commanded a regiment adjacent to mine at Crimea." "I remember. He seemed less hostile than most." Morrison was one of the few who knew the full story of what happened there. He has been trying for years to set the record straight, but without success. His letter today offered to testify before a military tribunal on my behalf, should I wish to pursue official exoneration. Catherine stopped walking. Marcus, that is wonderful. You could clear your name, prove that the newspapers lied. I could try, Marcus corrected. There is no guarantee of success. And the process would be public, painful, and potentially damaging to those I served with who chose to remain silent rather than support me. You would protect them, even though they abandoned you? I would not see good men's careers destroyed because they lacked the courage to stand beside me against popular opinion. He resumed walking, and Catherine fell into step beside him. But Morrison's offer, combined with last night, has made me reconsider. Perhaps it is time to fight back. Not for my own sake, but because the lies hurt more than just me. They hurt you, they hurt my sister, they taint my family name. Then you must do it, Catherine said firmly. I will stand beside you through whatever comes. We will face them together. Marcus stopped and turned to her, his hands settling on her shoulders. Why? He asked. Why would you subject yourself to more scrutiny, more scandal, more whispers? You could maintain the status quo, live quietly, and avoid the worst of society's censure. Because you deserve better, Catherine said simply. Because the truth matters. And because... She paused, gathering her courage. Because I care for you, Marcus. More than I ever expected to. More than is probably wise for a marriage that began as a transaction. For a long moment, Marcus simply looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed across her skin with heartbreaking gentleness. Catherine, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I have been a soldier for 20 years. I have faced cavalry charges, artillery bombardments, and enemies beyond counting. But standing here, looking at you, I find myself more terrified than I have ever been in battle. Why? Because I find I care for you as well. Deeply. And I do not know how to do this, how to be a husband in truth, not just in name. How to love someone without somehow destroying what we have built. Catherine's breath caught. You love me. I am beginning to, yes. His hand trembled slightly against her cheek. God help me, Catherine, but I think I have been falling in love with you since that first day in your father's garden when you demanded the truth from me. Joy flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. Then we shall learn together, she whispered. How to be married, how to love, how to face whatever comes. Together, Marcus. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close against his chest. Catherine could hear his heart racing beneath her ear, could feel the tension in his body slowly easing as he held her. Together, he repeated. I like the sound of that. They stood there in the gathering darkness, two people who had begun as strangers bound by necessity and found something neither had expected. Partnership, understanding, love. The tribunal proceedings began in January. Colonel Morrison, true to his word, testified on Marcus's behalf, providing detailed accounts of the situations at Crimea that had led to Marcus's controversial decisions. Other officers came forward as well, once Morrison had broken the silence. Men who had served under Marcus, who had witnessed his agonizing over difficult choices, who could attest to his fundamental decency and honor. The newspapers, predictably, had a field day. Headlines screamed about the butcher's defense, and questioned whether any amount of testimony could wash blood from guilty hands. Catherine read each article with growing fury, watching as reporters twisted facts and manufactured controversy where none existed. But something unexpected happened. Letters began arriving at Blackwood House. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Soldiers who had served under Marcus wrote to defend him. Families of men whose lives he had saved came forward with their stories. Even some of the Russian prisoners who had been released after giving parole tracked down the tribunal's address to submit written testimony about Marcus's honor and fairness. Catherine worked tirelessly alongside Margaret, organizing the letters, cataloging the testimony, providing the tribunal with an overwhelming body of evidence that contradicted the popular narrative. Marcus, meanwhile, testified in his own defense with the same direct honesty he had shown Catherine that first day. He did not claim to be blameless or beyond criticism. He simply told the truth about impossible situations and the burden of command. The tribunal's decision, when it came in March, was unequivocal. General Marcus Blackwood was exonerated of all charges of war crimes and excessive cruelty. The accusations, the tribunal found, had been based on incomplete information, deliberate misrepresentation by rival officers, and sensationalistic reporting. Marcus's record showed him to be an officer of exceptional skill, sound judgment, and deep commitment to both his mission and the welfare of his men. The newspapers that had crucified him were forced to print retractions. Society, ever fickle, suddenly embraced him as a hero rather than a villain. Invitations flooded Blackwood House. People who had snubbed them at the Chelsea ball now begged for their attendance at soirees and dinner parties. Marcus, characteristically, was unimpressed by the about-face. "They are still the same people," he told Catherine as they sorted through yet another stack of invitations. "They simply follow wherever popular opinion leads. Their approval means nothing to me." "It means you can walk freely without whispers following you," Catherine pointed out. "It means your name is cleared, your reputation restored." "My reputation with people whose opinions I do not value." He set down the invitations and crossed to where Catherine sat at her writing desk. "There is only one person whose opinion has ever truly mattered to me, and she knew the truth from the beginning." Catherine looked up at him, her heart swelling. "I did not know the truth from the beginning. I had to learn it. But you were willing to learn. You asked questions, you listened, you judged me on my actions rather than gossip." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "Catherine, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You have given me something I never thought to possess, a home, a partnership, love." "And you have given me the same," she said softly. "When Father first told me of the arrangement, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was beginning." Marcus raised her hand to his lips. "I have a question to ask you, and I need you to answer honestly." "Always. Our marriage has not yet been consummated. You know I have waited, wanting you to be ready, wanting it to be your choice." His gray eyes searched hers. "Are you ready now? Do you wish for us to be truly husband and wife in every sense?" Catherine felt heat flood her cheeks, but she did not look away. Over the months, her feelings for Marcus had deepened into something that went far beyond respect or even affection. She had caught herself watching him when he read in the evenings, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the capable hands that turned pages with surprising gentleness. She had lain awake at night thinking of him in the adjoining room, wondering what it would be like to truly belong to him. "Yes," she whispered, "I am ready. I want to be your wife in truth." Marcus stood, drawing her up with him. His hands framed her face with aching tenderness. "You are certain? There is no rush, Catherine. I will wait as long as you need." "I am certain." She reached up to trace the scar on his face, that mark of past violence that somehow made him more beautiful to her eyes. "I love you, Marcus, completely, and I want all that marriage should be between us." He kissed her then, slowly and deeply, with a restrained passion that promised much. When he pulled back, his breathing was unsteady. "Tonight," he said. "Come to me tonight, Catherine. Let me show you how deeply I love you." That evening, after the household had retired, Catherine dismissed Ellen and stood before her mirror in a nightgown of fine white linen. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed out her hair, letting it fall in dark auburn waves over her shoulders. She had never felt more vulnerable or more certain of anything in her life. The connecting door between their chambers stood slightly ajar, and through it she could see the flicker of firelight. Taking a deep breath, Catherine pushed the door open and stepped through. Marcus stood by the fireplace in his shirt-sleeves, his coat and cravat discarded. He turned as she entered, and the naked longing in his eyes made her breath catch. "Catherine." He crossed to her in 3 strides. "You are so beautiful. I have wanted this, wanted you, for so long." "I have wanted this too," she admitted. "I was simply too afraid to acknowledge it." He took her hand and led her to the bed, settling beside her on the edge. "We will go slowly," he promised. "If at any point you wish to stop, you need only say so." But Catherine found she did not wish to stop. Marcus was achingly gentle, treating her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. His hands learned the curves of her body with patient thoroughness, his lips following their path. He whispered words of love and praise against her skin, telling her how perfect she was, how long he had dreamed of this moment. When he finally made her his wife in truth, Catherine understood for the first time what union truly meant. This was not simply a physical act, but the culmination of all they had built together: trust, respect, understanding, love. She clung to him as pleasure washed over her in waves, crying out his name, feeling complete in a way she never had before. Afterward, they lay entwined, Marcus's arms secure around her, her head resting on his chest. His heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "My Catherine, my wife, my heart." "And I love you," she whispered back. "My Marcus, my husband, my home." Spring brought new beginnings. Catherine discovered she was with child in April, news that filled Marcus with an almost comical mixture of joy and terror. He became absurdly protective, insisting she avoid anything remotely strenuous, hovering until she finally had to order him to stop treating her as if she were made of glass. "Women have been bearing children since the dawn of time," she told him with amused exasperation. "I assure you I am quite capable of walking downstairs without assistance." "Humor me," he said, offering his arm anyway. "I have faced down enemy armies without flinching, but the thought of anything happening to you or our child reduces me to a nervous wreck." "That is rather sweet, actually." "It is utterly pathetic," he corrected, but he was smiling. The Earl came to visit in May, his face haggard with guilt and hope. Catherine met him in the drawing-room, Marcus standing supportively beside her. "Catherine," her father began, his voice breaking, "can you ever forgive me? I thought I was saving the estate, but instead I nearly destroyed your happiness. I believed the lies about General Blackwood." "Marcus," Catherine corrected gently. "His name is Marcus, father, and there is nothing to forgive. Your decision, though made for the wrong reasons, gave me the greatest gift of my life." The Earl's eyes widened. "You are happy?" "Deliriously so." She took Marcus's hand. "I have a husband who honors and cherishes me, a home filled with love, and soon I shall have a child. I could not have asked for more. But the newspapers said—" "The newspapers lied," Marcus said quietly. "As you now know. I harbor no ill will toward you, my lord. You made the best decision you could with the information you possessed. And as Catherine says, the outcome has been far better than any of us could have anticipated." The Earl wept then, tears of relief and gratitude, and Catherine embraced him, healing the breach that had stood between them. Lady Margaret Blackwood arrived in the world on a cold December morning, red-faced and howling, with her father's grey eyes and her mother's auburn hair. Marcus wept openly when he first held his daughter, this tiny creature who had somehow already captured his entire heart. "She is perfect," he whispered, his rough soldier's hands cradling her with infinite care. "Catherine, She is absolutely perfect." Catherine, exhausted but radiant, smiled from the bed. "She has your stubborn chin. I can already tell she will be formidable." "God help us all," Marcus said, but his voice was full of love. As the baby slept in her father's arms, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been given to Marcus as payment for debt, a transaction meant to save her father's estate. Society had seen her as the sacrifice, the unfortunate bride of the butcher of Crimea. They had all been wrong. Marcus had never been the monster they painted him. He had been a good man forced to make terrible choices in impossible circumstances, then punished for refusing to apologize for keeping his soldiers alive. The cruelty had never been his. It had belonged to those who judged without understanding, who preferred sensational lies to complicated truths. And she, the noblewoman given to the cruel war general, had not been sacrificed at all. She had been saved from a narrow life of duty and isolation, saved from never knowing the depths of love and partnership that now filled her days. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked, looking up from their daughter. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Catherine said. "That prejudice nearly robbed us both of this happiness, but truth and love prevailed." "Not just truth and love," Marcus corrected, bringing the baby back to Catherine's arms and settling beside them on the bed. "Courage as well. Your courage in asking questions, in looking past the lies, in choosing to see me rather than the reputation. And your courage in being honest, in fighting to clear your name, in allowing yourself to love again despite all the walls you had built." Marcus wrapped his arms around both his wife and child, holding them close. Outside, snow began to fall over London, blanketing the city in white. Inside Blackwood House, a family created from prejudice and fear had transformed itself through truth and love into something beautiful and enduring. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day in your father's garden?" Marcus asked. "You demanded to know what manner of man I was." "I remember. I was terrified. And now you know. What manner of man am I, Catherine?" She turned to look at him. This man who had been called a butcher and a monster. This man who was in truth the most honorable person she had ever known. "You are the man I love," she said simply. "The father of my child. My partner, my friend, my heart. You are exactly the man I needed, even when I did not know I needed you." Marcus kissed her forehead, then their daughter's. "And you are everything I never dared to dream I might have. My redemption, my joy, my home." Little Margaret stirred in her mother's arms, making small sounds of contentment. Catherine looked down at her daughter's perfect face and knew that this child would grow up hearing the truth about her father. Not the lies that had once filled the newspapers, but the reality of a man who had served with honor, who had been wrongly maligned, and who had found love in the most unexpected of places. The story would pass into family legend. How the Earl had given his daughter to the general society feared, how that daughter had discovered the truth behind the prejudice, and how a marriage begun as transaction had become the greatest love story either had ever known. Years later, when young Margaret was old enough to understand, Catherine would tell her the full story. The fear, the gossip, the painful tribunal, the eventual triumph. And she would end with a lesson that her daughter carried throughout her own life. Never judge others based on what the world says about them. Look deeper, ask questions, seek truth. For sometimes the person the world calls a monster is simply a good person who made hard choices. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unlikely ways. Marcus and Catherine Blackwood lived long, happy lives together. They had 3 more children after Margaret, 2 boys and another girl. Marcus eventually retired from military service to focus on his family and to advise on military reform, using his experience to improve conditions for common soldiers. Catherine became known for her charitable work, particularly her advocacy for veterans and their families. The newspapers that had once crucified Marcus eventually came to regard him as one of Britain's finest military minds, a man of principle who had been unjustly maligned. He was offered a knighthood, which he politely declined, saying that the only title he valued was husband and father. They never forgot how close they had come to missing this happiness, how prejudice and lies had nearly destroyed what had become the center of both their worlds. And so they lived each day with gratitude, with honesty, and with a certain knowledge that truth, though sometimes slow to prevail, ultimately triumphs over falsehood. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Marcus presented Catherine with a leather-bound journal. Inside, on the first page, he had written, "To my dearest Catherine, 25 years ago, your father gave you to me to settle a debt. He thought he was sacrificing you to a monster. Instead, he gave me the greatest treasure of my life. Every day since, I have been grateful for the prejudice that brought us together and for your courage in looking past it to find the truth. You saved me, Catherine, not from the false accusations, but from a life lived without love, without joy, without you. For that, I will be eternally grateful. Yours always and forever, Marcus." Catherine pressed the journal to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Around them, their children and grandchildren celebrated, laughing and talking, filling Blackwood House with warmth and life. She looked across the room at her husband, this man whom the world had called cruel, and felt her heart overflow with love. He was not cruel. He had never been cruel. He had been misunderstood, maligned, and misjudged. But he had also been patient, honest, and true. And in the end, that truth had set them both free. Free to love, free to build a life together, free to prove that sometimes the greatest love stories are born from the most unpromising beginnings. The noblewoman had been given to the war general, yes. But in truth, they had given themselves to each other, freely, fully, and forever. And in that choice, they had found not cruelty, but compassion, not sacrifice, but salvation, not an ending, but the most beautiful of beginnings.